Now we're going to transition to identification. First, we'll start with things that are not HABs. These are the three categories that are most commonly suggested. The people think they're HABs, and we have to explain they're not. Filamentous green algae, duckweed or watermeal, floating aquatic plant, or pollen. And we'll go through pictures of all three. There are many different kinds of filamentous green algae, and the best rule of thumb for identifying that is if it looks like you could go out and scoop it up with a pitchfork, or if it's bubbling or silky or foamy, or not foamy, bubbly. I said that already, didn't I? Anyway, if it looks like something you could grab out of the water, it's probably not a cyanobacteria HAB, because remember, we're talking about microscopic cells. Those don't have any structure, they don't hold together, and filamentous green algae often does. This is a type that usually forms on the bottom of ponded water, and again, you can touch it and stretch it, and cyanobacteria will never form strings like that. Duckweed from a distance can look quite a bit like a harmful algal bloom. It has that same neon green color, but it's just, they're floating. They're some of the smallest vascular plants, and they're floating on the surface. And if you look at them closely, you can see the individual leaves. This is not microscopic. These are macroscopic individual plants that you can see. If you look closely, they actually have a little root on the underside. So they're very different than algae or bacteria. And again, they're often mistaken for a HAB. Pollen is also one that we get calls about every year, and we can diagnose it pretty easily because it's usually in June. And we don't have very many harmful algal blooms in June, but pine pollen in particular is common at that time of year. It's usually very bright yellow and will form a surface scum like that, but it breaks up very easily, and it's just a matter of a few weeks. So now we'll switch to things that are harmful algal blooms. Unfortunately, harmful algal blooms can have a whole variety of appearances. There's not one quick rule. They can be green, blue, white, brown. They can either be mixed into the entire water column or just floating on the surface. They can be impossible to see any distinction, or they can form little clumps. So there's a lot of different characteristics, but I'll show you a bunch of pictures and then you'll know. So they can look sometimes oily or like spilled paint. That blue color is pretty diagnostic, but some people mistake it for petroleum products. But in this case, it's blue and green mixed together. Sometimes it's a bit more dull, like a pea soup, light green color. Again, really mixed into the water there. Here, this shows how it's really just right on the surface. So you can see here, it's just really the top layer of the water that it's floating. And here, some logs are actually trapping some water. And that's pretty common. Anywhere where there's reduced flow and mixing is where it can accumulate and float up and be trapped. But on a bigger water body or in windy conditions, you can see it completely mixed into the water, where it's just solidly green water, which is a different scenario. Sometimes when it floats up to the surface, it can form actually like linear lines on the surface of the water, even parallel lines or swirly windrow type formations. So this is just an example of that. And then other like docks, pylons, other materials on shore will cause it to get trapped and accumulate. And this is a scenario where it's sort of dying and decaying, so it turns that brown or white, blue color. And here the cells are probably dying and releasing what's inside of them, so these types of blooms can actually be much more toxic than those out in the open water with healthier cells. So here you can see how it's, you know, accumulating right on the shoreline where you might be recreating, but out in the open water, it's quite blue and maybe not an issue. So this plays a role in, again, how we talk to the public about it, because, you know, we can never close a water body. That is not a function of state government. We can only close beaches, regulated swimming areas. But we can advise people, you don't want to, maybe don't swim where it's green, but if you go out on your boat to the open water and it looks blue and clear, there's a low likelihood that you'll encounter health effects out where you don't see green water. So just because there's a HAB in one place on shore doesn't mean the entire water body is impacted, and certainly doesn't mean it's off limits. Sometimes, particularly in calm water conditions, it can form sort of clumps. But these are not solid. Like, you can't pick them up. If you poke these with a paddle or something, they'll just break into pieces. There's no substance to them. But it is kind of a characteristic of HABs, again, floating up to the surface. All right, pop quiz. We're going to start on the upper left and go across each row. And I would like you to say yes or no, is it a harmful algal bloom? Okay? First picture.
Yes.
Yes, so it's mixed into the water. It's very green. Pretty clear. Next.
No.
No. So there is clearly some kind of impairment, water quality issue there, but it's not a harmful algal bloom. There's something else going on. Next.
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty classic. The swirling, the white, the green, pretty classic. Next. No. So there's some filamentous green algae and some emergent aquatic plants mixed together. Next. You're hesitant. That's okay. This is yes. This is the kind of parallel streaking that I was talking about, which is caused when wind and wave action pushes it on shore. Next. Again, yeses and nos, and that's fine. This is sort of like medium conditions. This is actually out in the middle of a finger lake, Honeoye Lake, which has consistent low-level HABs all year round. And if we collected that sample, it would actually fall very close to our quantitative thresholds of what is a harmful algal bloom. Next. Now you're hesitant again, and that's because this is a really crappy picture. It's out of focus, there's no context. This kind of picture is not enough to help us back at central office to evaluate a picture. So if you are submitting photos to us, please step back, make sure you can really see what's going on. This happens to be a cyanobacteria bloom. Again, these are the kind of clumps that form that can be maybe the size of a penny or a walnut. But again, if you poke them, they would just disintegrate. Next?
No.
Correct. That's lily pads and some filamentous green algae. And the last one?
No.
Right, more green algae. Good job.